Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be talking about our People First Care Coordination implementation with a focus on enrollment and consent. And this discussion today is really focused on who is making the decision for enrollment and ultimately signing the consent form. So, we've heard from you all that more information was needed. We promised this was coming in the Module 1 training forum, and here we're going to go through this detail to help you understand the process for having decision making completed. So as you are all well aware, people who are currently receiving the MSC service, Medicaid Service Coordination, or Plan of Care Support Services, PCSS, have to transition into a new care management model and make a choice about which CCO they will receive that service from, and they need to choose between health home care management or the Basic HCBS Plan of Support. This is to ensure that everyone has continuity of care, meaning continuity of services. So since all services are defined in the current ISP that's managed by the service coordinator, the services will transition into the life plan and be managed by the care manager. So those pieces must be in place for services to continue. I want to give you a reminder that materials are available to help you with this transition in order to inform and educate the people who you're providing supports to. And those materials are the informational brochure, scripts that have been developed for MSCs to use as a framework to educate individuals and family members, sample information letters. By now you will have received, or your organizations will have received, the actual information letters for each of the people who are supported within your organization, so that you'll have that information to refer to that's quite detailed about the person and what options are available to them. There's also frequently asked questions documents. The toolkit is available from the OPWD website, and it's also available as a resource within the statewide learning management system under the training related to what MSCs need to know and do. So the purpose of today's training will be to discuss the role of the MSC provider and the Medicaid Service Coordinator in supporting the decision-making process for people currently receiving MSC and PCSS. It will explain what to do when a person is not able to make a decision and does not have a decision maker. Or, and we know these circumstances will come up, when a decision maker may not be available or may not be responsive in a timely way to the need to complete those consent forms and make the ultimate decision about the service options for the person. So Medicaid Service Coordinators and the MSC providers must monitor and ensure that choices have been made by every individual on their caseloads in order to ensure that their choice of enrollment for care coordination organizations are made and the type of care management a person will receive, which is the choice between health home or Basic HCBS Plan Support. So those decisions need to be monitored closely, and as they're completed and information is inputted into the choices system, you'll be able to know what people are outstanding as far as making those decisions. Supporting Medicaid Service Coordinators. MSC providers will coordinate the process for decision making and provide guidance for tracking decisions for the individuals on each caseload. So it's important to understand that this is an activity that will be managed. We're trying to ensure that there's consistency of practice across the state and across provider agencies for people who are receiving the MSC service. So rather than have each MSC seeking to get decisions made where there are challenges, the goal is to work within the organization structure of the MSC provider agency and be able to share information in a well-defined and coordinated way. So You will see, as an MSC provider agency, correspondence that will come to you as the Chief Executive Officer on the importance of how to make sure that this is being completed as required and that to support the continuity of care for people receiving services. So, you know, our goal really as a system is to make sure that everyone is understanding processes and flow so that the enrollment and the shift into the CCOs can be as smooth as possible. So now we're going to talk about who the decision makers can be and the process flow for different decision makers. So the three potential decision maker scenarios are three different ones. First is an individual can make their own independent decision, and as you can imagine, that's the easiest process flow. B, an individual is not able to choose, so they're not able to make their own decision, but they do have a decision maker who is available to them. And C, the individual is not able to choose and has no identified decision maker, or, and this is the circumstance I mentioned earlier, there is a decision maker that is identified, however, that decision maker is either unavailable or not responsive. And there may be certain instances where that person who is able to make the decision just declines to make the decision. So in those instances, an alternate proxy decision maker will need to be sought. So A is the person who is able to make their own independent decision. And as I mentioned, this is really the simplest of the processes. So the MSC discusses the option with the person using the toolkit materials that I referenced. The consent form is completed by the individual with support provided upon that person's request. So certainly if they want to talk to somebody else, better understand things, you can assist them, other people in their circle of support can assist them, but ultimately they will make their decision about which CCO they want to choose and which level of care management they want to participate in. The MSC will then record that selection in the choices system, and that screen, as you know, will be available as of April 15th. And the MSC will then gather the information needed to share with the CCO and to provide that information to the CCO during the course of the transition. So now let's talk about who can be a decision maker. New regulation was initiated, emergency regulation, that clearly defines who can be decision makers on an individual's behalf. And in this instance, if an individual lacks the ability to enroll in a CCO or disenroll in a CCO or act in the CCO review process, but they have a guardian who's been lawfully empowered, that guardian can enroll them in the CCO, they can sign the consent form, they can act in the CCO review processes, they could disenroll the person, they could appoint an alternative party to make actions or decisions, and they can seek assistance in any way that they need to make the decisions needed for the person to choose their CCO or choose the service level that they want to participate in. And then beyond legal guardians, the regulation also identifies other people who can act on that person's behalf. And they would act on their behalf in the order listed on this slide. So you'll see that first is an actively involved spouse, second would be an actively involved parent, third would be an actively involved adult child, fourth, an actively involved sibling, adult sibling, fifth, an actively involved adult family member, and then the Consumer Advisory Board for Willowbrook class members are able to make decisions on the behalf of Willowbrook class members. So those are the areas where the regulation has identified who can be a decision maker. So here's a flow chart related to that scenario. First, the MSC needs to identify the decision maker is needed. I think it's important to note here that this decision making, the level of of review required for who needs to make a decision maker is the same as what's used in today's world. It is not a higher bar than where people are able to make decisions on their own behalf in many areas of their life. If they're able to make their own decision in most areas of their life, then they're able to make this decision. This process, this change to CCOs, does not change that. It's the same standard that's typically used. So once an MSC identifies that the person needs an available decision maker, they would look at the regulation and the information that I just shared and determine who the appropriate decision maker is for that individual. Most often we see an actively involved family member. So the MSC would provide the information to the decision maker using the materials in the toolkit. So this follows along with the same process as if you're educating the individual in the first scenario. Now you're providing that education to the decision maker. The decision maker then completes the selected consent forms, and the MSC documents the selection in the choices system, and then the MSC gathers the required documents and gets those to the CCO. So that's the process for when somebody has a decision maker available who is making that decision. So C is the last group, and that is the process for individuals when a decision maker is unavailable. So if an individual lacks the ability to choose a CCO and does not have a guardian lawfully appointed to enroll them, and there are no parties available to make a timely decision, and that's from that listing of group of possible decision makers, no one is available, then the ability to make the decision on the individual's behalf shifts to 3 different people, or different roles within the system. First is the CEO of the agency operating the individual's residential facility, which could be the family care home or a residential program, a certified IRA. That's the first group. Second is if the person's residential facility is run by the state of New York, by the DDSOO, then that would be, the decision maker would be the director of the DDSOO. And third is if somebody needs a decision maker, has no one available to them, and they're not living in a certified residential setting, then the decision making would default to the DORO Director. So that would be for the region within which the person is living. It would go to the DORO Director. So here's this list a little bit more clearly. The 3 different people or roles, I should say roles, not people within the system who can make decisions on an individual's behalf would be the CEO of a residential agency for someone living in a certified residential setting, the State Operations Director for a person living in a certified state-operated residential setting, and the DORO Director for individuals living in an uncertified living environment. So those are the three roles within our system where this decision can be made according to the new emergency regulation. So now let's go through this process for someone who does not have a decision maker. And we're going to go a little bit in more detail on this for a subgroup here. But let's just go through this process. MSC identifies that a decision maker is needed and that none are available, so similar to the other decision maker. But in this instance, there is no actively involved family, so the MSC provider agency needs to submit a request for a decision, including the current ISP. It would also need to include consent forms and the individualized letter, and that will be a packet of information that's submitted to these potential proxy decision makers. It's important to note here, and you'll see that the MSC provider agency is the point of contact for getting the request out for a decision to be made. So the MSC provider agency, executive director, or who they designate, but the direct responsibility will fall to the CEO of the MSC provider agency to know who needs decisions made and to put the requests into the appropriate organizational roles, organizational entities to get those decisions made. So let's follow this through for an example of someone who is living in a voluntary operated residential setting, one of the 3 options for potential decision makers. The MSC provider agency would submit the request with the information needed, including the IFP consent form, the individual's letter, for review by the VO residential executive director, who would then issue a decision by signing the consent form for the desired CCO and the level of service, meaning care management, health home care management, or the basic plan of support service, and then return that to the MSC provider agency. And it's critical here to see that these flows are happening at the agency leadership level. And that is so that we're not having MSCs seeking contact with various entities within these different groups, meaning voluntary residential programs, state-operated residential programs, or generally different people within a regional office, because that could really lead to some chaotic process flows and where people aren't understanding what their role is in getting the decision. So we really want to ensure that you all are using kind of a single point of contact within each entity, and that that's managed by the leadership of the organization so that there's a smooth process flow for those decisions to be sought and completed. So this is an important part of this decision process, so I'm spending a little bit more time on it. Then the MSC documents, once they receive the consent back from the decision maker, the MSC documents the selection and choices on the screen and then gathers the documents needed to send to the CCO for that person. So the responsibility of the MSC providers are that the agencies must monitor individuals for whom, as of May 15th, a choice has not been made by their identified representative within the emergency regulation hierarchy. So what that means is, let's take, for example, the actively involved family member. You've identified that a person has an actively involved family member. They make the decisions on that person's behalf pretty routinely, but in this case, they're not getting back the information that you've requested for them to make that decision. You will, as an MSC agency and MSCs, will attempt to contact those representatives in order to ensure that the consent is completed. Those contacts must include at least 3 documented attempts. So if someone's not getting back to you, you have to keep trying and have at least 3 of those attempts. Those contacts may include letters, telephone calls, emails. Any of those types of contacts can be utilized, and all contact attempts must be documented, and they can be documented in your MSC service notes. The representative will be informed that decisions and forms must be finalized by June 1st, and if necessary information is not received by that date, then the agency CEO or DDSO director makes the decision for the choice of CCO for care management services based on the person's needs. So really think of that last flow for people who don't have decision makers, and if there's an individual who has a decision maker that's not responsive, they'll fall into that last flow. What you'll need to do in order to get the decision, and we're going to go through the detail on this, but what will be needed in order to pursue a decision from an agency representative such as the SO director, the CEO of a residential provider, or the regional office director in these instances that I'm describing will need to be the Decision Making Information Packet. And I've already referenced this in the C flow mentioned earlier. So that will include the Individualized Information Letter, the blank consent forms, the current ISP, And in the instances, and this is only in the instances where you're seeking them to make the decision because the decision maker that was sought was not responsive or not available, then you would need to submit documentation to show the efforts that were undertaken to get that decision maker to complete the consent form. So in other words, we don't want just one attempt made and nobody got back to me and I made the attempt 2 days ago and now it's the final date and we need a decision. You need to get a head start on documenting those areas where someone has not been responsive so that as quickly as possible we can get the people who aren't making decisions as of June 1st into the flow of getting decisions from the appropriate directors who are able to make those decisions on their behalf. So here's the flow for individuals living in voluntary residences. Again, the CEO of the voluntary residence is designated in the emergency consent to make decisions for individuals. So if no response is received from the decision maker that you've sought, the MSC agency CEO or representative will contact the residential agency CEO and provide the decision-making information packet that was just referenced on the prior slide. The residential agency CEO will then make the decision on the individual's behalf and send the consent back to the MSC provider. For individuals living in an uncertified living environment, the same process would occur for the use of the DORO Director. So the DORO Director is designated in the emergency consent for those individuals not in a certified environment. If no response occurs from the potential decision maker, as we described before, then the MSC agency CEO or representative will contact the DORO and provide the decision-making information packet. The DORO Director will then make the decision on the individual's behalf. So the responsibility of the decision maker is to make a judgment based on the knowledge of the person, and they're going to be basing that knowledge on the ISP that they received, if there are any special characteristics that you think are important for them to consider in the decision-making process. As an MSC, you should communicate that to them. Very often, there will be a desire for continuity of care. So if someone has an MSC that's working with a particular individual or family, and that MSC is going to be working now with the CCO within the region, it may be very important to maintain that relationship and allow that continuity of care to occur in the decision that's made about the CCO. They'll also need to make a decision about what's most appropriate, either the health home care management or the Basic HCBS Plan Support. They'll need to then complete and sign the necessary consent forms and send those completed packets back to the MSC agencies. The target date is to try to get all of this done by May 15th, but we know that for those people who are awaiting decision makers, that may take a bit more time. It'll start being tracked on May 15th so that progress reports can be shared with all involved entities to make sure that where decisions aren't being reached, that there's active outreach to ensure that those decisions are completed. So this is a step to complete the enrollment following a decision, and it's referenced in all of the flow charts above. But once the MSC agency receives the signed enrollment form, they'll need to ensure that the following steps are completed. They're going to complete the CCO selection screen in choices, and as I've mentioned, and you are aware from other trainings, that screen will be available as of April 15th in choices. You're going to provide the required paperwork to the selected CCO, and that will include the most recent ISP, DDP2 or CAS, meaning functional assessment information, and the signed consent forms. And those need to be the original signed consent forms that need to be maintained by the CCO. So it's the actual piece of paper with the actual signature of a pen, with a pen on it. If the individual is enrolled in the HCBS waiver, the LCED determinations and related documentation for that also need to be included and sent to the CCO. So as you can tell, we're going to be undertaking, and I'm sure many of you have already started, to work on gathering the information and the consents needed and working together with the various certified residential providers, with our regional offices, to make sure that these decisions are being made and that documentation of those decisions are happening as smoothly and efficiently as possible. So we all need to collaborate and work together. So for individuals who do not make their own decisions and don't have a guardian, needing to work collaboratively is critical. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time today. This is a lot of information. Hopefully it's good reference material for you as you move forward with working with each of the individuals that you support to get the decision that you need and to document that decision. And with that, we'll go through some questions. So thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So we're going to take a minute to look at the questions, and then we will get to answer some of those that you've submitted so far.
All right, so we will begin answering the questions related to today's topic of the decision maker. So the first one is, what if a parent is in the process of establishing guardianship but does not currently have guardianship at this time? Who would be considered the decision maker?
So that's a great question. Guardianship is not required in order to assist someone with this decision making, so you would need to refer to the slide, and absolutely an involved parent or a person who cannot make their own decision can participate and make that decision with and for the person without the requirement of guardianship. The two processes would be, on separate tracks.
What would happen if both parents are the legal guardians, but the parents disagree on either the CCO or the service of choice? Or in a situation in where parents may be divorced, how would those situations be handled?
Well, obviously these are always very difficult situations, and that will frequently happen, whether it's, two parents who may disagree, or you'll have situations where adult siblings may be participating and don't agree. And really you need to follow the same processes that you would do today as a Medicaid service coordinator to help reach consensus on this. And then if consensus really cannot be reached, I think it's a matter of addressing it through your leadership to try to resolve those. But obviously those are always difficult decisions, but in these situations I would expect that, probably the service coordinator has some experience working with the individual and their circle of support in terms of reaching decisions.
Can a parent for someone over 18 with power of attorney but not legal guardianship choose the CCO and sign the consent form? Okay.
So just to be clear, you need to look at the slide related to the decision-making flow. Guardianship is not required in order to support someone's decision-making. That's not something that OPWDD typically does for many of our services. We do not require that parents have guardianship in order to support their adult child in decision-making. So an involved parent absolutely can support and participate in this decision-making process. There is no requirement for guardianship related to that, and I think that's very helpful. And maybe we could okay, just a minute.
Who signs the form if a person is able to make the decision but also has a legal guardian?
Well, the person, right, the person who has the ability to do it, they would control the decision. The person has the capacity to make their own decision. There's no need to go to the guardian. The person's decision would outweigh that of the guardian. Presumably, though, if a guardian has been appointed, there may be a reason why that guardian's been appointed. That person may or may not have capacity to do that. So there shouldn't be, you know, that situation may require some additional investigation, but the way that the waterfall works now is if the person has the capacity to make this decision, that's the first person that you go to and it's their decision, right? The guardian comes into play only if the person needs some support in making the decision, or if the person doesn't have capacity to make the decision, then it falls to the guardian. And if there's no guardian, then it goes through the actively involved individuals listed in the order in the regulation.
Would an advocate, not a family member or a legal guardian, be considered a decision maker?
No, an advocate is not listed on the list of individuals that are independent decision makers. Having said that, an advocate could, if the person needs some support in making the decision, and if through that support they can come to their own decision, certainly an advocate or other person close to them can do that. Also, the regulations speak to the ability of people to appoint other people to make decisions. So if somebody who's in the correct order on our regulation wants to appoint somebody to make those decisions, there's a potential for somebody who's not on the list to be appointed to make decisions for an individual.
And just so folks are aware, the waterfall, as we discussed, the parties that can participate in that are in the regulation, but also described on slide number 12.
What if a family refuses to sign any documentation, or they feel that they need to consult with an attorney first before signing documents, and they haven't been signed by July 1?
One more question. Read that again, please.
So what if there's a family who's refusing to sign documents and they're consulting with their own attorneys and they're not signed but by July 1? What happens in that instance?
Well, you know, there's a difference between refusing to sign and, you know, seeking additional counsel to make a decision. You know, Kate, you can probably speak to what happens after July 1, but certainly we want to be able to allow a family who's seeking additional information to have the time they need to make those decisions. Obviously, there's certain limits to that, but, you know, Kate, what if that exceeds?
I mean, my recommendation for a service coordinator is to make sure that you are communicating very clearly with the family and that, you know, they understand that there is a requirement for continuity of care here. And then if it does get to the point where it is June and one has not been identified, then I think it's important to communicate with, you know, following the flow that was outlined earlier with the leadership in your MSC agency regarding the status of that person. What we are very concerned about, first and foremost, is that everybody has a service coordinator on 7-1. The other thing that I just want to make clear here is that a decision may be made for 7-1 to ensure continuity of care, but if an individual or a family member or anyone who is, you know, can appropriately make that decision as we've described, changes their mind, changes can be made. So I think it's important to realize that, you know, there's two important factors at play here. One is continuity of care and making sure everybody has a service coordinator, which I think is, you know, obviously first and foremost very important. But then also that ability to change at a later date if so desired. So those are two things that I think are important to keep in mind.
Have the CEOs of the certified settings been informed of this requirement?
There will be information coming out post-haste to all providers related to this information. We wanted to very much begin the conversation with our MSC service coordinators.
Is it considered a conflict if the CEO of the IRA that the individual is living in makes that decision?
For an individual who does not have a decision maker and does not have the capacity to make a decision in our system, there are a number of instances where that person who lives in a certified residence will ultimately support the person and make those decisions if needed or act in that capacity. So again, in terms of making sure we have continuity of care with the understanding that changes may be made at a later date, we do not think that's a conflict of interest.
Sorry, we're just taking a moment. We answered a lot of questions. We're looking through another batch, so we'll be back in 1 moment.
When will the consent forms, to join care management be available?
They are currently available. We've actually just received the link on the DOH website that they're available, but we've also provided all the consent forms to your MSC provider, so you should be able to get them through your MSC agency, or we will be providing the link that they're available on the DOH website as well in further communication.
How should we handle the transition for people in programs like FSS case management, non-Medicaid, and Willowbrook case management?
So we provided some initial communication on those pieces, but additional information will be available that are going to the CCOs and MSC providers to communicate. We are continuing all of those services to ensure continuity of care, so we will look for that information to be coming, but we will ensure that those services will transition to the CCO.
And the only thing I think I would clarify related to that is when you talk about family support services, case management, there may be a couple ways that happens. So it could be FSS contracts, and it could be more on a unit basis where an actual service is delivered and then it's paid with state funds. For most cases, we believe that the FSS contracts will continue. Many of them are with organizations that do not deliver MSC, So, for example, Parent to Parent would be an organization that has an FSS contract that does provide care management for folks who are not eligible for Medicaid. Those would be continuing. But as was mentioned earlier, there will be further information forthcoming on that. But to be clear, telephone care management and the Basic HCBS Plan Support services, the two options, are for folks who are eligible for Medicaid. So what we're talking about are those relatively small numbers of care management services that are now paid with state dollars for people who today are not eligible for Medicaid service coordination, and after July 1, you know, without Medicaid would not be eligible for either of the two options that will be available to Medicaid enrollees.
Regarding the children's consent forms, what happens if the child does not communicate using words, and what happens if the parent or guardians do not want to discuss the information on the consent form with the child?
So I think it's important to clarify that the information on the consent form only needs to be discussed with the child if the child has an understanding and can really have that conversation. For somebody who does not have the capacity or does not understand that information, those topics do not need to be discussed with the individual.
To say that in a different way, right, the key thing is, does the child on that particular section have the capacity to individually to provide informed consent to those particular services, right? So if they do not have the capacity to provide informed consent to, you know, certain family planning services, you know, that's something that's the key question to ask.
What RIO should be written in on the adult consent form?
So we've been able to communicate with CCOs that they need to identify their RIO affiliate to the MSC provider they are affiliated with, so that your MSC provider can advise you on the appropriate RIO to include on the consent form.
Do we upload the consent forms when received and input them into choices?
So the consent form and the signature on the consent form needs to be a hard copy, a wet signature, and you need to retain those consent forms, and the hard copy needs to be provided to the CCO.
One moment, we're going to look at a few more questions.
The only document in Spanish is the informational brochure. Are the consent forms going to be provided in Spanish?
Yes. So the consent forms are available in 7 languages, and the link that will be provided includes all those versions. So that will be available, and it is available in Spanish, English, and other languages as well.
Regarding the individualized letters, have these letters for families gone to CEOs yet? And who do we contact if we have not yet received our individualized letters?
So the vast majority of letters have gone to agencies. So the likelihood is that your agency has received them. There are a small number that either bounced back or there were some other technical difficulties related to the transmission, and we would anticipate by the close of this week that everybody would have them in hand. But the chances are good that your agency has in fact received those letters.
regarding the health home care management checklist, it states that we should schedule a life plan review. Is this different from the semi/annual review dates?
So it should not be different in most cases than the person's existing annual review date. Obviously, if there is a change in need or there is some other significant reason that would change, then you could put in a different date. But at this point, we would expect that for most people, it's probably going to be a continuation of the person's existing schedule for plan meetings.
The checklist requires the individual/family signature at the end. When should this be signed by the family? And if signed by the family, what about families who live in another state?
So it can certainly be emailed or mailed to families if that's necessary. We've asked that those be completed by the end of July, so it is not a requirement absolutely for enrollment, but it does need to happen at the start of services for people who choose the health home option.
Will the health home care management and the basic HCBS be considered a standalone waiver service?
So that question, I think, really derives from individuals who today receive Medicaid Service Coordination and do not receive other HCBS waiver services. Health home services are not a waiver service. They are a state plan service. But for individuals who are enrolled in either MSC or Plan of Care Support Services, all those individuals have the choice of either health home care management or the basic HCBS plan support.
And for our last question regarding going back to the individualized letters, is it the responsibility of the MSC agency to get those letters to families?
Absolutely. So that's part of the education and outreach process that we sort of discussed with the flow with you today. So the expectation is, as part of the Medicaid Service Coordination's responsibility to ensure continuity of care and services for folks, that letter is provided to individuals and families, however is deemed appropriate based on individual needs. So it could be mailed, it could be emailed, it could be shared during a regular face-to-face visit, however is deemed appropriate for the person.
I think we've covered a lot of questions today related to the decision maker process and the consent. I know that there will be more information forthcoming on how to complete the consent forms. Kate, would you like to add anything else related to the consent forms?
Yeah, just a few statements here. First of all, we do want to really thank everyone for your participation. We understand what a big lift this is for service coordinators, but it's important and we think really is going to enhance services for people. So your role here is very much appreciated. We will be and are preparing materials that will be sent to you, and we are looking to schedule an intervening training to do a deeper dive on the forms themselves. We've gotten some questions here today. We certainly have had questions come in through the mailboxes. So we are now working on another opportunity for a presentation, and by the end of the week I expect we will have that announcement out to you all so that we can do kind of a deeper dive on what those forms mean, and how to have that conversation with individuals and families who you serve.
I'd like to just remind everyone that that a recording of today's presentation will be available on the website within the next few days, as well as the slides used for the presentation that you'd be able to print out if you want them. And with that, thank you all and have a good afternoon.